Но то, что вот этот Алеша известно Болгарии всей.
Sure, yeah, Sistine Chapel from Michelangelo, well, predominantly him with the ceiling.
Yeah.
Right, some other Renaissance artists working on other frescoes throughout it, but then, that artwork taken in its totality against someone like Hieronymus Bosch, who I still think is highly overlooked.
Yeah.
When you look back at this period and underappreciated, he's one that I've both recognized his artwork as great, and we'll see what you think. In my opinion, in some ways, warp speed ahead of his time.
Yeah.
As much or more so than anybody else in certain ways, and I'll maybe, I will defend my position on that with a couple points, but tackling some of the same subject matter in a way, but doing it in playful and novel and interesting and challenging ways. So, do you want to start with some intro on this? I'm assuming maybe, are you going to put like a couple images up for viewers to see it, or just encourage them to go look at it on their own?
I might put them up, in between us talking. One thing I'll say, so the reason why I wanted to talk about this, I was going to do like a standalone video on this, but I figured, whatever, let's just do this in this conversation. I was watching some video from like a graphic designer, and it was just titled "Why is Modern Art So Bad?" And he actually made some pretty good points in the video, as far as like, we were talking earlier about like how, with certain works of art, modern art, if you just, let's say, magically take away like any sense of like the person's talent, it's a problem that we could have potentially, modern art that would look the same even if we like completely omit any question of talent whatsoever. Like, bringing in a canvas, whether or not like you're some kind of great philosopher and you have some wonderful idea you want to make with a blank canvas, that in terms of artistic talent takes no artistic talent, right? So there is no logical way to distinguish between some modern artworks that are the product of talent versus not. And if that's the case, that kind of calls the entire thing into question. His like contrast, right, with modern art, the example that he decided to go with was the Sistine Chapel. And, this just like, it caused, me to like roll my eyes. Not that I think like, the Sistine Chapel is like bad art and, Michelangelo was like bad at what he did. That's not true. It's just more so that it's such a kind of like trite example. When people think of like, what is an example of like, a human achievement, it's very natural, like, oh yeah, Sistine Chapel. And this strikes me as like the wrong way to think about it, because the kinds of implications that are, just associated and rich with the Sistine Chapel, they kind of take you down the wrong path. So like, first of all, the fact that it's just so vast, right? That kind of gives this unnecessary thought, right? That, hey, because it's so vast, like talent is sort of innately associated with, like, hey, can you make a painting that's like 12 feet by 12 feet? Wouldn't that be wonderful? I guess, but that doesn't strike me as very relevant, right? So there's like an incorrect association there. The second part of it is that you alluded to in your discussion of Bosch. Michelangelo at his best was a great artist, but he was also kind of like very limited by his time period. He was very limited by the kind of content and the kind of the ways that he was like interpreting religion. He was clearly very, very talented in the purely technical sense, right? But okay, so I'm gonna just pull this up here as I'm talking about it, and we're gonna put these images up for people. But so I'm kind of ignoring the Sistine Chapel in general. I'm just looking at the most famous part of it, in the very ceiling, the very top, which is the birth of Adam. And so, first of all, I think this is by far the best part of the. This is the best part of the painting. And the reason why I think this is the best part is there's a lot of tension here that is just necessary for the arts, right? We don't know for a fact whether this is Adam being born after being touched by God. We don't know if, and you sort of get that sense where he's sort of kind of like, he looks like he's maybe just awaking. We don't know if the fingers touching was like the moment of ensoulment, right, where God provides a soul to Adam, and he was already a body before. And the fact that we don't see the fingers touching, I think that's so critical to make this work. Like, imagine how much lesser this piece would be if they were like holding hands or something.
Yeah,
right. Like
exactly.
just or like imagine like Christina's world with like at the edge of Christina's world, at the edge of that painting, you see like just like a hint of a wheelchair, right? Like it just wouldn't work anymore, right?
Yeah.
The reason why Christina's world works is there is something existential about her struggle and her inability to get to wherever she needs to get to across this expanse of grass. Here, the ineffable part is we don't exactly know what's going on with this touch. We don't see it, but we feel the tension. We feel the power, right? And you know, this is an example of like a great artistic decision, right? This is a legitimately great artistic decision. But when I look at the rest of the Sistine Chapel, I just don't, I'm looking at it now, I just don't see anything there. Like, outside of the birth of Adam, everything else, like, in the way that it's portrayed, they're fairly trite representations of, like, well-known biblical stories. And I guess it's kind of different that, like, you know, Christ is presented almost, you know, looking like a wrestler. But there's nothing inherently, you know, of artistic value in the way that I just described. There is no moment of tension. There are no, like, you know, decisions that really stand out and are memorable. I think there's a reason why, of the Sistine Chapel, like the most famous portion of it is the birth of Adam. Like, it's not a coincidence. When we were talking about how society over time just makes these kind of artistic decisions for us, like what are the artworks that we're going to allow for down the line. Time has sort of made that decision. You know, when we think of Sistine Chapel, we think of the birth of Adam, right? And we should, right? This is Michelangelo. This is Michelangelo at his best, right? And you know, it's always nice if we could remember art and artists at their best. So before I even get to Bosch and the differences there, and by the way, like, you know, the one I'm gonna talk about, Bosch's the Garden of Earthly Delights, and that painting was done around the same time as the Sistine Chapel, and also, but Bosch was also older, right? So, you know, Michelangelo came after Bosch, which is another, like, fascinating thing. But maybe you should talk about the Sistine Chapel first before we get into Bosch.
Sure. So a couple main thoughts in response to yours. I would say that, you know, I agree with you that immediately one of the first things that makes us, you know, stand in awe of that artwork is the scale and is the placement, you know, up on the ceiling in all these panels. From a technical standpoint, enormously difficult to pull off, right? I mean, he doesn't just get to stand there with an easel conveniently and chip away at it. From everything I've ever read, you know, he's basically on some scaffolding on his back by candlelight, you know, working on this, which has probably been exaggerated a little bit, but seems about right. And, you know, again, I'm no great draftsman or painter. I mean, to try to conceive of executing that is pretty outlandish, you know, and it deserves props for sure from that standpoint.
Yeah,
But
and at minimum, this is something that so much of modern art has simply not done. Right, they're not capable of this, even at a basic level. Right, so this already is like way ahead of so much of the art that we see, like pretty much of any time period in the world. Right.
Oh yeah, for sure. And then I agree with you too on the birth of Adam is the centerpiece. Both literally and just from the core of an artistic value standpoint of that entire work. I think this again gets a little bit to our earlier part of the conversation about like this intrinsic or now built-in understanding in some way for humanity as a whole on what's the best of something. If you asked somebody to describe the Sistine Chapel ceiling to you, they would say, "Oh, that's the one where God and Adam almost touch." Right? I mean, probably, at least in part. So to me, that does get to the idea that that's the greatest part of this artwork. And that's what's proliferated the most. But you start to ask some other questions and say, okay, if we took all of these off of the ceiling and put them, in a standard gallery as individual panels or works, what starts to happen? We start to get pretty standard Renaissance imagery.
Yeah.
Right? Of it's exactly what you said, of biblical scenes, of things that other artists have been working on in slightly different variations for, centuries by now. Mm-hmm. It's not to say they're not, well executed. Of course they are. But, it seems to me that even just from a little skimming of like art criticism of the Renaissance, plenty of other people argue for other better painters from that time than Michelangelo. Yeah. I don't necessarily feel qualified to comment on the technical sides of his versus Raphael's versus whoever's painting, but anyway, I think that's what you have to start to do. You have to start to say, okay, if we take it out of the Vatican and this grand setting, what becomes of it? And I think it becomes a lesser work. So people go to this place where you're already primed for awe, just because of the nature of where it is and the type of building that it is. And of course, it is still a grand work of art and wonderful in certain ways and aspirational, no question. I haven't been there personally. I don't know if you have, but I would like to see it, definitely. But then I start to invert this a little bit too and say, okay, so then what if Bosch's works, what if the Garden of Earthly Delights was as grand of a scale? And I'm sure the dimensions of like that triptych are online here. I haven't really looked that closely.
It's fairly large, but obviously not like the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah, so it's large, but not that large. But if you take that and put it up on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, it kind of expands it, but it doesn't need to be up there.
Yeah. You
know what I mean? Like it just, the ideas come through and they're communicated. Obviously, as you just said, it already is a somewhat large scale work. I'll give you another good example of this, and then maybe we can talk about Bosch specifically. But I remember this same kind of feeling when I was in Florida some years ago, and I went to the Salvador Dali Museum there in St. Petersburg. And they had a Picasso-Dali side-by-side exhibit going through the whole museum. So it was actually a great opportunity to see a ton of both of their work, near one another and kind of intertwined. And they had a few of Dali's largest ever works on display. And I think you can still argue that they're great works, but I remember, standing back from them and being like so in awe of the simple scale of the thing that only later was I like, but was that the best painting I saw there of his? Like it feels like it in the moment in a way, because it's kind of inconceivable that he could have, and in his case, it's all from imagination too. So it's just like wild that this is what came out of his brain and his hands. But anyway, you get what I'm saying there. It contributed to, at first glance, like just a visceral reaction and evaluation, and only later then can you step in with some more, cogent thoughts on the thing and really evaluate just the ideas being communicated there. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. One thing that I noticed though is that people, they do kind of like, they do try to hide behind this idea of scale, right? Sometimes, sometimes there's like justification. Like, I'm sure seeing a Dali, like, which is already like a great work of art, um, in like some kind of tremendous scale. Like, first of all, it would be very different from the ways that I've normally seen it, right? If I, for example, like, I'm not sure how, I forget the name of the painting that has like, it looks like these elephant-like, camel-like figures. Like, I can imagine if that being like, 5 times the size of me, that would be, pretty incredible to witness beyond like what I've seen. But, you should be able to put things in miniature, right? To see it on a small screen or whatever, and get a sense of, this is either badly done or it's well done. I did see, a bunch of, I was in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, and I saw at the Van Gogh Museum, some of the most famous works by Van Gogh, and the physically, like the way that he just manipulated paint in terms of like putting it on almost as if it's like cement, right? Like making sure that the physical layering of it, caking it on, that it's jutting out of the canvas, that you could physically feel it if you touch it. It would be very rough and it could cut your fingers. That definitely enhanced it, right? And even now, like if you go to like, wiki art or something that lets you really like zoom in nicely, that, the physical sensation that you would imagine what the paint to be like, I think that has some, importance to the artwork, right? That you don't necessarily see if you're to look at a painting like on your phone or something. But
For sure.
you should be able to tell, like, when we look at the Sistine Chapel and we look at everything outside of the birth of Adam, it's just pretty trite, right? Like, and on some level, like, I wonder what Michelangelo himself thought of this, because he did say over and over again that painting is like a lesser art form. For him, it was like like sculpture was like the thing.
Right.
I'm not sure of his like literary opinions, but who knows? But to him, like sculpture was a thing, and I just wonder if like this is just the equivalent of like like a paint by numbers, but people don't normally get to say that because this is just kind of like hammering you over the head, like this is great, this is great, this is great, this is kind of like an apex of human achievement. So this is why, like in that video when he decided to use Sistine Chapel, it's like you could use that example. It's an example that everybody knows, but there are better examples of human achievement, specifically from the perspective of artistic achievement, which itself is like beyond mere technical know-how.
Sure.
And another thing in that video that sort of bothered me is, so he titled it "Why Modern Art is So Bad," but the thumbnail, and he probably didn't even understand that this is not analogous, right? You can't just make this transition. The thumbnail text said, "Why is modern art so ugly?" The two are completely separate questions. Like the idea of, beauty, what's gorgeous, whatever, that's a completely separate question from what is a great work of art, right?
Yeah.
Michelangelo is beautiful, right? Michelangelo's David is beautiful, right? It's a beautiful body. It's exactly like when I think of like, oh, what is an ideal male form? I would say that, right? This is beautiful, right? It's muscular, but not too muscular. It's clearly athletic. It's clearly healthy. It's well proportioned. It doesn't have the kind of, modern, bodybuilding pecs that are just kind of, look much more feminine than masculine. Although people could be upset hearing that, it's just true. So to me, like David is like an ideal male form, but it's definitely not even close to being like the greatest sculpture as a work of art, right?
Right.
It's probably not even the best among Michelangelo's sculptures. I think probably the Moses sculpture is even better than the David, but one of them I think is more beautiful in this kind of generic sense. And there's also other things that we could say about beauty that are kind of counterintuitive. So, like, behind me I have the poster to The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, one of my top 5 favorite films, maybe my favorite film, period. And I would say that it's a very beautiful film, despite the fact that, the lines, like the dialogue, it's not, very poetic dialogue. The shots are not like Antonioni style shots, right? So they're not like beautiful in the classic like cinematic sense. But there's so much beauty in like when Ben Gazzara's character like stands in front of his crowd, like near the end of the film, and he's talking about Rachel who leaves the club after like they get into like an altercation and he gets shot, and he visits her at her house. He stands there and he says, she was black and she was beautiful, and I loved her, and I drink to her. And you sort of see him like just standing around, and you're wondering what exactly is going through his head. So he's been shot and he might be dying, who knows. He has just had this like very long over the top night, and the thing that he's most concerned about now is this moment of like he's trying to perpetuate this thought of Rachel in his head, and he knows that he can't quite keep it there, right? There is some kind of beauty there in in this kind of like transience and this kind of loss, in the same way that in a traditional objective sense, I guess a beautiful 20-year-old woman is more beautiful like in the biological sense of like a 40-year-old woman, but a 40-year-old woman has an advantage that a 20-year-old doesn't have. Like, she could have some weathering on the face that shows, a maturity and turmoil and reality that is itself its own kind of beauty, right?
Sure.
As a 35-year-old man, you would probably be like very turned off by the thought of like an 18-year-old girl, right? But you might have, desires for a 40-year-old because there is some sort of affinity there, right? That is necessary beyond like just mere physical presence. So that's another kind of beauty. Like, imagine beauty. Like, I think some of the most beautiful stuff in the world is it's material that has like a hint of ruin to it, right? Like,
Yeah.
when you look at Roman ruins, there's a beauty there that you don't get necessarily if you were to see an actual replica of what it looked like in the past, right? There's a beauty even in the human face that's a little bit weathered. There's a beauty in that scene that I described, but that that is not necessarily the same thing as artistic greatness, right? Only one of those things that I just described like reaches art, which is The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Looking at a beautiful 40-year-old woman's face is not necessarily art. And none of these other things are art, right? Roman ruins aren't necessarily art, right? Even architecture to some degree, it's more kind of like small A art. So this kind of confusion that people have, like they could look at a Michelangelo and they'd be like, oh my God, like the forms are so beautiful and they're so, Jesus Christ looks like a wrestler. Isn't that so, important and talented and innovative? And, I guess there is some innovation there, but that's not, that's not that important. And, yeah, so I mean, have you noticed that yourself, like this kind of confusion that people have with like beauty versus art? I just see it kind of like all over the place.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's one of the main ways that that the all art is subjective argument slides itself in.
Yeah.
Right, because if that's your metric, then I tend to be more in agreement with you. Like when I take photographs, for example, most of the stuff I'm attracted to it might literally be ugly to a lot of people. To me, it's very beautiful. there's something about, this thing, and I'll sit there and look at, whatever, a twisted piece of metal, and part of the beauty to me is that it's now discarded, it's set aside, but in my brain I start to retrace, what the life of that piece of metal would have been or something, right? Okay, think about all of the things it's gone through, the people who have interacted with it or created it or used it for a while and now set aside, and like there's so much to that to me that constitutes beauty. To a lot of people it wouldn't, and so yeah, when you make that your top or toward the top of your list of things that boxes you're trying to check, to determine whether an artwork is good or great, you're going to run into some problems there. I'll use photography again as an example. There are plenty of beautifully made photographs of beautiful things. Doesn't make them particularly, worthwhile artistically. And so on and so forth. I mean, some of my very favorite photographers and photographs, it's grainy, it's grungy, it's grimy. It could be of a thing that's in decay. I mentioned to you maybe before the photographer Edmund Teskey, who, used this a lot in his work and purposefully manipulated and in ways mauled his prints, but ended up with something gorgeous out of it and wholly unique, and I think great. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you there. To me, Bosch is also beautiful. If we want to transition to talking about his work, I do think it's beautiful, but again, not in a traditional sense. It's not maybe as straight on beautiful as Michelangelo's modeling of his figures and whatever else. But I do still think, Bosch clearly had a ton of technical talent. From what I've read, and I don't know if this to be 100% true, but he painted in oil on wood panels, and he also purposefully did not put layer upon layer upon layer of varnish over his finished product because he wanted some texture. He wanted some kind of a roughness to the work, and he also, whether he was doing this consciously or not, that shellacking over and over by a lot of other artists on their wood panels was meant to show that perhaps this thing had been divinely created. It was more perfect. It was more whatever you want to say. Like it just came this way, straight from the heavens or something. Yeah. And he cast that aside for the most part, and so. To me, maybe I'll read a few of my comments on his stuff. So I think Garden of Earthly Delights, and it sounds like you're going to talk about that one, probably his greatest work. Just immense to me in terms of the ideas, in terms of the ingenuity, the humor, the playfulness. I get the sense of him, chuckling to himself at least a little bit, drawing and painting some of these forms on there. I think some of his other works too, The Last Judgment, The Temptation of St. Anthony, Visions of the Hereafter, Christ carrying the cross, prime examples of his mind and his style. And so to me, the works are great in and of themselves, but I think it also shows the greatness of Bosch as an artist because he presaged so many other things with these works. You see something like Van Gogh's style, right, with that rough texture that he left there. You see surrealism. You see Fauvism. You see
you see like Chinese, like a painting and ink painting, and like I'm just looking at the left panel now. So the left panel of Garden of Earthly Delights. So like at the very top of it. So at the very top of it, this looks like it could be, other than like the fantastical elements of it. It looks like it could be from like a Chinese a painting, like one of those like many classic paintings depicting like poets like Li Bai, right? In some kind of vista, but they never really have a focus on, the kind of like hyperrealism that we might see in the Renaissance.
Yes.
These kinds of, trees that he has here, they're just like, let me put them in, let me just put just enough color. Let me try to work like with omission as opposed to just merely larding it on. From a purely kind of like perspective sense, there is no real perspective. Like everything is just
No.
sort of like vertically layered.
It's kind of flat. Yeah.
If you were to assume, the rules of perspective, like these things in the back would be just absolutely gigantic, but we know that they're not, right? We know that every figure that you see is kind of like more or less the size of any other figure, of a comparable size. We could talk about like Michelangelo saying, okay, I'm going to turn Jesus Christ into a wrestler. He says, I'm going to put Jesus Christ into the creation myth. And I'm going to have Adam just sort of like sit, like lie down here essentially. And I'm going to have him like very nervously kind of like wrap his feet around, the robe of Jesus Christ. And I see some analyses of this painting, and they're like, that Adam is looking lustfully at Eve. I don't really see lust. I see kind of puzzlement. I see, perhaps amazement. She's looking away. He's looking. Jesus Christ is looking at the viewer. And an interesting thing about this painting is, all the stuff that Bosch is known for in terms of like the hellscapes that he makes. Like all of these creatures are the same creatures in the hellscapes, right? This is supposed to be like pre-judgment. This is supposed to be even pre-fall.
Right.
Technically, I guess we don't, since we don't know the function really of Jesus Christ here, we can't quite say that this is like pre or post fall. I mean, I don't quite know. But these figures, like, for example, this kind of like fountain, right, with like water coming out, it doesn't seem to be like a pleasure fountain.
No.
But when you look at the middle panel, right, where everything is just about like, engorging on pleasure, those are just like these Rube Goldberg machines, like meant for pleasure, in the same way that his hellscapes have Rube Goldberg machines that are meant for like pain, right, and torture. And you look at this thing in the left panel, and you're like, what is this fountain even really for, right? Like it seems to have like faces when you look closely enough, but you don't quite know what the function is. But you also know, looking at his other paintings, that these like little figures, like you have this like little mammal eating another mammal. This is the same thing that's going to appear in the hellscape. And some of these creatures are clearly not real, right? Yes, like some of the stuff is just completely just out of his head. But this is the way that he chooses to depict the creation myth, and just based on just this one panel alone, this, from a purely like philosophical or like idea driven perspective, this is so much better and so much more interesting than most things that Michelangelo has done in terms of religion and depicting religious ideas.
For sure.
And yeah, like moving into the middle panel. Let me just pull it up. So it's like 3 times as big as the other panels, and yeah, again, like first of all, like I just noticed this today. There are a number of, and I don't know how these figure into art more broadly, especially like European art, but there are like a number of figures here that are clearly like African, right? Maybe they are slaves. Like I see analyses that say that these are supposed to be like primitive humans. I don't really think so. They don't seem like they're primitive humans to me at all. They just seem like they are. The interesting thing is they are engaging in the same exact like earthly delights that everybody else is. There's nothing here like with these like African figures that are just they're literally gray, right? They're almost blacked out. But they're not presented in a way that's any different from anybody else. Like they're literally part of the same kind of like mass orgy, if you want to call it that. Nobody is treating them any differently. They don't seem to think of themselves as any different. And Bosch is not treating them any differently. They're just participating in the same kind of stuff that everybody else is participating in. And one thing that I noticed today that I wanted to talk about this with you, because we talked about the Leonard Shlain book, Art and Physics. Maybe we're going to do a show on this down the road. But yeah. I noticed something really interesting here. So there is an African woman in like the pool, like in the center, and on her head there's a peacock.
I see that. Yeah.
And I just noticed this for the first time. And okay, so I don't think Bosch just randomly put in various creatures, right? He had reasons for many of these creatures, and you could even before you like open up like any sort of like religious analysis, you could figure out what some of these creatures are meant to do here, like functionally. And so in Art and Physics, Leonard Shlain is making this argument that what artists do is they see further ahead than other people, and you could discuss this in different ways. I presume the way that Shlain does it is he says that artists are able to perceive discoveries in physics before they're in fact made by scientists, and to me this is just kind of like a more specific argument. Like a subsection of the broader argument, which is artists see further than other people, period. Right? And this has one of the ways that this has played out, according to Shlain and according to the examples and the arguments that he makes, is in the realm of science and physics. And here, you could sort of make the same kind of idea. Like Shlain, he sort of focuses on stuff like perspective and, time and how these were adapted by artists before, the contributions were made by Einstein and others. But I mean, so we have a peacock here. We know that this triptych is meant to show what happens with getting like too decadent, too self-indulgent. What is the end result of being too committed to like this garden of earthly delights, like too committed to the earth itself, as opposed to perhaps higher concerns. And here we have a peacock, right? But this was the 1500s. We know that a peacock is like when you look at any like biological text, like anything that explains evolution to you, especially stuff like sexual selection, they always bring out the fucking peacock, right, as the example of like ornateness for ornateness sake and wastefulness, and for a male to have an elaborate sort of a tail, it indicates that although it's wasteful, there must be some level of evolutionary fitness that is less visible, right? Perhaps this male is hyper aggressive, perhaps he is very caring in terms of being a partner and with his offspring, who knows, and this signals to the female that this is a good mate. But the example there is always like, this is ornateness for its own sake. It's wasteful. It's stupid. This is what we try to avoid. And here, like in the center of this painting, that is supposed to be about this kind of wastefulness, we have a peacock. So I wonder what Shlain would have thought of this if he would have stepped outside of like this kind of it's a great book, but it's a little bit limited in the sense that a lot of the discussion just is geared towards like discoveries in physics, which that's definitely part of it. I think he makes his case, but that's not the only thing. And here, like, if we want to still stick it to like, a discussion of sciences, we have a peacock here, right? And we have similar creatures elsewhere that are, they're either scary or ornate for their own sake. Like there's something just unnecessary about it, right? Yeah. So, here we have a kind of like, invisible and unconscious thinking ahead. I'm not sure if you want to say anything more about the two panels before we get to the hell panel, which is also interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting insight. I hadn't noticed that detail when I looked at it prior, so I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to it, but just generally agree with you. When you do notice the African figures or black figures. It is quite interesting. Who knows if he's attempting to make any kind of, socio-political commentary with that, or if it's just purely, symbolic and part of his artistic vision, but it is certainly unique and interesting that they're included. And yeah, you have, even maybe my final thought, and then we'll move on to the hell panel, is like, you can feel the direction this is going in a way, right? And but it doesn't quite go there, and so he leaves you, with this as an artwork unto itself, but it does set up the next panel. We see someone being, what looks to me, borderline consumed by a clamshell, or like, it's closed in upon them. You've got.
Are you talking about the hell panel, or still on the
I'm still on the center panel.
Exactly. Yeah, and you see like pearls, like you see pearls coming out of it. So like he's getting something of like, like, oh my God, I'm getting money out of this. I could sell this shit. But it's this like there's like an advantage here that later on, like, we lose all advantages in the hell panel.
Yes, exactly. So right now it's still working okay. Even things like if we're talking about the fountain in the first panel, and in this panel, these several figures here, I guess it adds up to be 5 other like little huts or houses or domes, but they're simultaneously like intriguing and sort of beautiful, but a bit hellish. Like they're spiky and they're weird and just again, a bit of a preview into what's going to come next when this all collapses. But again, he's in his own territory here for the painters of this time. So it's just great. It's amazing.
And this is even more detailed than the Sistine Chapel, right?
Yeah.
But that detail is just like detail for detail's sake. Oh, what are we supposed to do? Okay, well, I have some religious people to satisfy, so let's just do classic stories from the Bible, get this over with. Here, you have even more detail, but all these details, they are taking you somewhere. Like, there's a reason for them. Like, I'm looking at the very left. There's this kind of weird, it looks like a flower that's kind of blowing a bubble of some sort. But this bubble, like, it has veins in it. It's almost as if, you see like the veins in a leaf. But this would also be like the veins you would have, like, on a lung or something. And inside this kind of like, ensconced in this kind of, almost like perfect kind of, environment, you have, the 2 figures. I don't think it's like Adam and Eve. It's just 2 random figures. And they're clearly, lusting after one another in some way. Right below, though, you have this kind of disturbing thing where you have like some kind of mammal with a tail. Looks like it's not a rat. Maybe it's some kind of piker or something. And you have like a man's face coming out of it, and is observing it, right? Because this animal, like, it's kind of cute. It doesn't seem to be a threat in any way. I assume this is like a very clean kind of location, given the nature of the painting. But this is exactly what you would see later on in the hellscape, right? But it's going to be twisted into like, now it's an actual threat. Now, here you're just indulging in so much and you're laughing about it, but I think we can move to the hell.
Yeah, let's go there.
Yeah. So you want to just start that off?
Sure. So just building on what we were saying here in the past few minutes. This is everything kind of reaching this crescendo, maybe in a way a logical endpoint. I mean, Bosch was still, we'll presume, a religious person in some way, and so he is moving things toward the religious or Christian endpoint after all the indulgence. But this is the one, and this is probably the most famous panel of the 3, I would say. And it is just incredible in its own fresh ways, because now, of course, we've just on a technical level, we've swapped the colorful cotton candy color palette for these dark tones, ochres and grays and black. But there's so many interesting little surprises in here too. So for example, right toward the center, maybe top-ish center, there's this human face poking out of that disc right beneath the like heart or lung-shaped pink object.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
supposedly that's potentially a self-portrait of Bosch. So he places himself in the midst of all of this. Again, there's multiple potential interpretations that are layers of meaning. We have really strange imagery, like what looks like a knife blade coming out of two ears that are kind of skewered together. Mm. We have animal skulls, like an arrow through the eye, but there's still people like attempting pleasure here.
Yeah.
And like striving for it to the bitter end, while obviously everything crumbles around them. And as you said, some of these, animal figures feature once again. But I mean, this to me is so, like, the jump from here to Dali is very clear. I mean, that's the next artist I immediately go to every time I look at this.
Yeah.
And but it's just amazing that Bosch was doing this so much earlier.
Yeah. I mean, like, think about it. This was like before, like many of the classics of the Renaissance, and
yep.
The Renaissance gets so much attention, but like when you think of like a hellscape and what what that kind of fear might look like inside a person. It's going to look something like this. It's going to be disturbing. It's not just going to be like, devils with like pitchforks or,
No.
Like people burning in fire.
This is what a nightmare looks like. Yeah, it's things
this is what a nightmare looks like. Yeah.
Life,
yeah.
But just totally chopped and screwed.
Yeah.
In a weird way. Yeah.
Yeah, and and like just like we had those Rube Goldberg machines designed for pleasure in the previous panel. Here, they're just designed for pain. Like you look all the way at the bottom, and you have that kind of bird, that big blue bird sitting, I guess, on this kind of weird throne. Mm-hmm. I mean, like what's going on there, right? Like we have essentially like, okay, so you have this like green figure, and his hands are tree branches. And he's grabbing like the tits of this like lady, and she looks like she's pregnant actually. So he's grabbing her stomach, he's grabbing her breast, and it's like a tree branch grabbing it, right? So that's pretty sinister. You have this like weird mammal that's like right next to her. Like he himself seems to be like behind a kind of like glass or just some kind of like window where he's able to look out on all these tortures as he creates them. And this in a weird way, like when you think of like siege engines and you think of like modern tanks and all of that, like this is kind of what it is, right? Like a person that's like completely ensconced and protected, looking out while like just delivering all this like mindless carnage all around. And then going up to the bird, like the bird is eating a human being.
A leg. Yeah.
You have like birds coming out of the human's ass, and instead of like seeing like you like a lot like there's virtually no blood here. I see like some bloody like parts like a bloody rag or whatever, but there's no blood here. There's simply the consumption, and at the other end you have out of this like weird blue kind of sack, you have all these human beings like that he's eating. They're not like being like chomped to death. They're simply passing through this empty body out of the sack into this pit of like vomit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And into this pit of like you have like these coins being shitted out by like this other guy. And you have like you have like some woman who's like she seems to also be part of this torture, and she's just saying like she's holding back the guy's head as he's vomiting into the pit, and she's like essentially saying like, okay, like this is just our function, like you're vomiting and I hold your head. And then you have another woman that's like so used to this torture, she's just bored by it. So, and all those like cute animals are kind of like weird from the other panels. Now they're being put for like a use of torture, right? Yeah, like this is just so much imaginative than like baseline Renaissance, right? Like, I think there's no, there's no comparison. there's no comparison in that regard. The last thing I'll say is at the very top, like probably my favorite is the use of the light. You know, there's like some kind of war going on, right?
Yeah.
There is, you know,
Yes.
these might be the kind of like new people coming into hell. I mean, who knows? But there is some kind of war going on in the background. The lighting is unlike anything that, you know, I've seen, I think, you know, like compared to other artworks of its time or before, right? I have not seen light used in just this way. And the thing that is most reminiscent to me of this, I mean, he's not a contemporary, but if you look at the painting by El Greco, View of Toledo, this is the same use of light, right? The same reasons why I love El Greco, and the same reasons why he would be like a great artist. This is being used by Bosch, and let me I forget what is the time period of El Greco. Yeah, so like around the same time, right? So two people, right, are coming to the same conclusion. They're like, you know, there's something to be used with light in a way that people have not used it before. Maybe they're uncomfortable using it. Maybe they haven't thought about it. But I'm going to use it. Bosch is using it. So, you know, yeah. So yeah. I mean, this is pretty much as I have to say about that.
Yeah, exactly. And my final thought too is, again, just, you know, the imaginative power that we've talked about, and the advanced, you know, announcement of some of these trends and ideas in art, and even like, yeah, this whole top of that panel where you're looking at the light and the color palette used, it even in a way reminds me of Cubist works. Like some of the darker toned Picasso Cubist works, or George Braque. Mm-hmm. You know, so there's even some of that, hints of that in here. I mean, I don't want to get too carried away with attributing every single artistic idea and movement thereafter to Bosch, but it's really impressive. Yeah, is the bottom line.
I wonder to what degree, and this is like one of the injustices, like when I think of like poets like James Emmanuel, it's pretty clear that by the time that he becomes like world famous, at that point we would have already had, you know, the work of Dan Schneider. We would have had like, you know, other, you know, great poets that would be coming up maybe. So James Emmanuel has not had the opportunity to like really influence the arts, which is the fucking shame. Like he did a lot. You know, he wasn't like such a crazy like innovative writer in terms of like technique or form or anything like that, but you know, at his best, like he had, you know, great poems, and these are great worthwhile poems. He had ways of discussing race that were very different from the ways that a race got discussed in the arts and in poetry. And you know, he hasn't had a chance to influence people, and you know, I wonder to what degree, you know, Bosch had a chance to influence artists, because you know we know him now, he's famous now, but you know, others are more famous. I would argue that, you know, perhaps like Dali is probably like a greater artist. So to the extent that he was influenced by Bosch, this was clearly a good thing. And you know, this is like an example of all of that being in action, right? Like how are we building this infrastructure? How are we building for the next world? Where, well, you know, Bosch was around, and he did what he did, and a few centuries later, Bosch was able to, you know, in a sense, like give birth to someone like Dali, right? This is how the world moves. This is how things change. You know, it happens in the sciences. It happens in, you know, every other field. There's no reason to assume that the arts are somehow innately disconnected from, you know, the fabric of reality, you know, compared to like anything else in the world, right? It moves by the same logic. It moves by the same needs. Yep. So yeah, like, yeah, and I wonder, like, you know, like Bosch was to some degree like ignored for a long time, and that's an injustice. Like, it would have been a richer world for everybody if Bosch's influence was allowed to be out there, and to you know, maybe we could have had a Dali earlier on. And if we would have had a Dali earlier on, maybe we would have had the next iteration, which has not come to pass yet.